Here we are again. What I See When I See Leopards, Part 4. We start with Chapter 4 of the novel, Love at Donna Fugata. Since the storylines of the novel and the series are starting to diverge, let me take a moment to remind you of where we were in the storyline of the novel. We had just spent the day hunting with Don Ciccio, talking about the vote, obtaining intelligence about the Sadara family. Then they return home, where the prince locks up Ciccio in the gun room while he communicates Tancredi's marriage proposal to Sadara. All goes well. Tancredi looks to be set for life with all these new estates, and when it's all over, Don Ciccio is set free. Chapter 4 takes place November 1860, 1 month later. It begins, as meetings due to the marriage contract became more frequent, Don Fabrizio found an odd admiration growing in him for Sadara's qualities. He became used to the ill-shaven cheeks, the plebeian accent, the odd clothes, and the persistent odor of stale sweat. And he began to realize the man's rare intelligence. Many problems that had seemed insoluble to the prince were resolved in a trice by Don Calogero, free as he was from the shackles imposed on many other men by honesty, decency, and plain good manners. He moved through the forest of life with the confidence of an elephant, which advances in a straight line, rooting up trees and trampling down layers, without even noticing scratches of others and moans from the crushed. As these friendly feelings grow between this odd couple, the prince seeks business advice from Sadara. The eventual result of such advice, cruelly efficient in conception and feeble in application by the kindly Don Fabrizio, was that as years went by, the Salina were to acquire a reputation as extortioners of their own dependents, a reputation quite unjustified in reality, but which helped to destroy their prestige at Donna Fugata and Quarchetta without in any way halting the collapse of the family fortunes. From the prince, Sadara also picks up a few manners. Gradually, Don Calogero came to understand that a meal in common need not necessarily be all munching and grease stains, that a conversation may well bear no resemblance to a dogfight, that to give precedence to a woman is a sign of strength and not, as he had believed, of weakness. And what is the profit of all this for the mayor? Well, from that moment there began, for him and his family, that process of continual refining, which in the course of 3 generations transforms innocent boors into defenseless gentry. The novel strikes this rare tone here that I can only describe as good-humored fatalism, all this endearing warmth on the road to ruin. And this idea of how fortune's wheel continuously lifts and pulls down new classes of people, it would be medieval in its outlook if the novel didn't also see it as so predictable. Then there's a description of Angelica's first visit to the Salinas after the engagement. She runs up to the prince to embrace him and kiss him. The prince paused, perhaps just a second longer than necessary, to breathe in the scent of gardenia on adolescent cheeks. After this, Angelica blushed, took half a step back. "I'm so happy." Then came close again, stood on tiptoe, and murmured into his ear, "Nuncle." A highly successful line, comparable in its perfect timing to Eisenstein's business with the pram, and which, explicit and secret as it was, set the prince's simple heart aflutter and yoked him to the lovely girl forever. So Eisenstein's business with the pram refers to this scene from Battleship Potemkin. So this matches the emotional stakes of the moment for the prince when Angelica leans in close to call him Nuncle. It's again a wonderfully overdramatic description. And again, it uses a detail from a time period that the prince will never see in his lifetime. The film was made in 1925. These future ruptures in time seem to be claiming for this story a relevancy beyond its specific history. It's broken out of its timeline to be in conversation with all these other times. Then there's a description of each family member embracing and kissing Angelica. Concetta was particularly affectionate. Her joy was so intense that the tears even came to her eyes. This is such a terse little line that can get lost in the outpouring of description of everyone fawning over Angelica. And I love that because it reflects the way Concetta's place in this scene is just a little drop of what's going on. No one in the scene might even really notice her. But if you know how to look at it, the interpretation of the moment can be heartbreakingly sad, as you come to understand that what looks like intense joy is not really joy at all. She puts on a brave face that gets hijacked by feelings for Tancredi that still won't be denied. And even as everyone rushes to greet Angelica, There is one notable exception. Only Bendico, in contrast to his usual sociability, crouched behind a console table and growled away in the back of his throat, until energetically called to task by the indignant Francesco Paolo, with still quivering lips. It's not exactly clear what Bendico is picking up on here. Is he reacting to Angelica herself? To what he senses is Concetta's pain? Or maybe it's his own jealous memories from something that happened the night when Angelica had come over for dinner and first met Tancredi. But to let the dog's reaction stand in such contrast to the human reactions is just brilliant. Lighted candles had been set on 24 of the 48 branches of the chandelier, and each of these candles, white and at the same time ardent, seemed like a virgin in the throes of love. The twin-colored Murano flowers on their stem of curved glass looked down, admired the girl who entered, and gave her a fragile and iridescent smile. The great fireplace was lit, more in sign of joy than to warm the tepid room, and the light of the flames quivered on the floor, loosing intermittent gleams from the dull gold of the furniture. It really did represent the domestic hearth, symbol of home, and its brands were sparks of desire, its embers ardors contained. It is something when all the objects in the room conspire to express a passionate joy. And there's something very special about Angelica and the promise of her life with Tancredi that wakes up the place. Recall in the film how Angelica's entrance on the night of the dinner caused the whole room to reform around her and want to receive her. This is continuing that same phenomenon. The princess starts to tell Angelica stories about Tancredi as a child, including how at the age of 12 he stole a handful of cherries. As this episode of banditry was being recalled, Concetta burst out laughing. "That's a habit Tancredi hasn't yet been able to rid himself of," she said. "Do you remember, Papa, how a couple of months ago he took those peaches you'd been so looking forward to?" Then she suddenly looked dour, as if she were chairwoman of an association for the owners of damaged orchards. I have to say, I was never before familiar with this technique of comedy by profession, but Lampedusa does it so well. Remember, he did it before with Father Perrone. In any case, Concetta's indignation continues. But note her wound is not as fresh as when they were all visiting the convent and Tancredi wanted to get in. And because of that, her words now are not as harsh. Here she's more understated, a little more artful. For those unaware of her feelings or of the history of the recipient of those peaches, they might not even notice anything. The prince takes over the conversation and speaks about Tancredi's bright political future. He will go far, he says. For Angelica, actually, she did not care at all about Tancredi's political future. She was thinking, we've got the money and that's enough for us. As to going far, such youthful simplicity she was to discard completely when years later she became one of the most venomous string pullers for Parliament and the Senate. Well, that's a bit of a bombshell. So again, we have that flash-forward technique the novel has been using, but this time it's not just a passing detail or about the political future. It's a sudden glimpse into the completely changed woman Angelica will become. It's a shocking juxtaposition to her present self, and with a single sentence, Lampedusa prods us to suddenly imagine for her a life full of changes and events that might connect us to that future self. It's a huge prompt for just one sentence. Part of the shock of glimpsing the future Angelica is that we don't get any sense of her present self as manipulative. She seems very much to live in the moment, as youth should, and be subject to everyone else's machinations around her. Note that when the miniseries deviates from this and makes their Angelica more calculating in her youth, well then, it's no big shock if you told me that she was going to become this future political puppet master. And that's a very big difference. As anyone who has observed marriages will tell you, who someone becomes is not always apparent at the outset. And the surprising trajectory of the novel spurs the imagination and can lend more insight than this linear path of the miniseries that's more predictable. So after this successful visit by Angelica, we learn that the prince has recently gotten into the habit, after the rosary and before dinner, of gathering the family around the fire and reading to them from a modern novel. He, of course, uses great discretion in his choice of material, and in discussing his taste, Lampedusa has this great anecdote. A couple of Balzac's volumes had, through various subterfuges it is true, reached the hands of Don Fabrizio, who had appointed himself family censor. He had read them, and then lent them in disgust to a friend he didn't like. I hope you'll agree with me that it's really unfair how the humor in this novel is never recognized. It really is an essential element for me in the joy of this novel. It's during one of these evening reading sessions, during a thunderstorm, that the footman runs in to announce that Tancredi has unexpectedly arrived. Surprise swept Concetta into a time which no longer corresponded with reality. And darling, she exclaimed, but the very sound of her own voice led her back to the comfortless present. And, of course, such a brusque change from a secret warm climate to an open frozen one was most painful. Luckily, the exclamation was submerged in the general excitement and not heard. It's just 2 sentences, but they're absolutely devastating. As they're about to pass through the front door to meet Tancredi, there appeared a heavy, shapeless mass. It was Tancredi wrapped in the huge blue cloak of the Piedmontese cavalry, so soaked that he must have weighed a ton and looked quite black. Careful, nuncle, don't touch me, I'm a sponge. The light of the lantern on the stairs showed a glimpse of his face. He came in, undid the chain which held the load at the collar, and let fall the garment which flopped on the floor with a squelch. He smelt like a wet dog. For the last 3 days he had not taken off his boots. But to Don Fabrizio, embracing him, he was the lad more beloved than his own sons. For Maria Stella, a dear nephew basely calumniated. For Father Perrone, the sheep always lost and always found. For Concetta, a dear ghost, resembling her lost love. Note that even having grown up in the Selina household, even without Angelica's novelty, Tancredi still brings such life into the home with his entrance, and everyone has such an inspired emotional relationship with him. I hope you can understand why I criticize the spiritual hole at the center of the miniseries that sports a Tancredi without these deep emotional attachments. Of these attachments, we must remember Bendigo, also again found his dear comrade in play. One who knew better than anyone else how to blow into a snout through a closed fist. But he showed his ecstasy in his own doggy way by leaping frenziedly around the room and taking no notice of his beloved. So Tancredi has shown up with 2 other soldiers, Count Cavriaghi, who they've met before. He used to come with the general to the villa, and Lancer Moroni, the soldier who serves Tancredi. The prince gets them settled in their rooms so that they can dry off and change clothes. And Tancredi dashes off a quick note to Angelica, telling her that he's returned and will visit her in 2 hours when he's cleaned up and presentable. The young men clean up and change quickly, and as they appear in new military uniforms, a confused prince asks them, "Don't you Garibaldini wear red shirts anymore?" Tancredi responds, Garibaldini indeed, uncle. We were once, and now that's over. Cavriaghi and I, thanks be to God, are officers in the regular army of His Majesty, King of Sardinia, for another few months, and shortly to be of Italy. When Garibaldi's army broke up, we had the choice to go home or stay in the king's army. He and I and a lot of others went into the real army. We couldn't stand that rabble long, could we, Cavriaghi? Cavriaghi responds, heavens, what dreadful people. Good for ambushes and looting, that's all. Now we're with decent fellows, and we're proper officers. So, as you can see, as in many revolutions, factions come together, factions come apart, and change continuously in all directions. And some people just seem to always be able to navigate these changes to some comfortable spot. And the flattening of class divides only goes so far. Reasons are given for this, but who knows how legitimate they are. Cavriaghi has brought Concetta a present. Remember, they knew each other from before when he spent time at the villa with the general. It's a beautifully bound book of poetry inscribed with Concetta's initials, CCS, and the words, "Forever Deaf." Concetta was amused and laughed. "Why deaf, Count? CCS hears perfectly well." The face of the young Count flamed with boyish passion. "Deaf, yes, deaf, signorina. Deaf to my sighs and deaf to my groans. And blind, too, blind to the begging in my eyes. If you only knew what I suffered when you left Palermo to come here. Not a wave, not a sign as the carriage vanished down the drive. And you expect me not to call you deaf? Cruel is what I really should have written." His somewhat literary excitement was chilled by the girl's reserve. "Count, you must be very tired from your long journey. Your nerves are not quite in order. Calm yourself. Why not read me a nice poem?" Recall that Cavriaghi was also present in the miniseries. He was there to basically confess a love to Concetta and then to be promptly rejected in favor of Tancredi. At that point in the miniseries, remember, Tancredi and Angelica were not yet engaged. See how much richer this relationship is in the novel. Kavriagi has done something thoughtful and romantic with the gift of the book of poems. He's not as passive as in the miniseries, so he's a real force for Concetta to contend with, and she does it well. And we learn a little about her strength and her spirit in the process. We have space to explore what this might be. It happens in the shadow of Tancredi, but he doesn't squash the possibilities immediately, as in the miniseries. Uncertainty as to what may emerge in a relationship is much more dramatically compelling than a moment of melodrama that quickly comes and goes. In a romantic relationship, this getting to understand the person in front of us, and also ourselves in the process, it deepens any decision that's made down the line. Suddenly, Angelica shows up. She was not able to stand the waiting, so she's run over in the rain. The sight of her and the contrast between the beauty of her face and rusticity of her clothes was like a whiplash to Tancredi. He got up, ran to her without a word, and kissed her on the mouth. The box, which he held in his right hand, tickled her bent neck. Then he pressed the spring, took the ring, put it on her engagement finger. The box dropped to the ground. "There, darling, that's for you, from your Tancredi." Then irony broke in. "And thank Nuncle for it, too." Then he embraced her again. Sensual anticipation made them both tremble. The room, the bystanders seemed very far away. And he felt as if by those kisses he were taking possession of Sicily once more, of the lovely, faithless land which now, after a vain revolt, had surrendered to him again, as always to his family, its carnal delights and golden crops. Angelica would become a frequent visitor to the Selina home. Tancredi wanted to show Angelica the whole palace, with its inextricable complex of guest rooms, staterooms, kitchens, chapels, theaters, picture galleries, odorous saddling rooms, stables, stuffy conservatories, passages, stairs, terraces and porticos, and particularly of a series of abandoned and uninhabited apartments, which had not been used for many years, and formed a mysterious and intricate labyrinth of their own. Tancredi did not realize, or he realized perfectly well, that he was drawing the girl into the hidden center of the sensual cyclone. And Angelica at that time wanted whatever Tancredi did. Their wanderings through the seemingly limitless building were interminable. They would set off as if for some unknown land. And unknown indeed it was, because in many of those apartments and corners, not even Don Fabrizio had ever set foot, a cause of great satisfaction to him. For he used to say that a house of which one knew every room wasn't worth living in. Again, another reminder that the wealthy are not like us. Most of us probably don't have rooms left to discover in our homes. Now, the statement about the prince may seem similar to what was spoken in the series between Angelica and Tancredi, but let's look at it carefully. So the conversation in the miniseries was Angelica asked how many rooms there were, and Tancredi says that, well, the prince thought it was vulgar to count. Do you see how that conversation differs from what's described here in the novel? The prince could be perfectly familiar with every room in the house, but still not know the number, and still consider it vulgar to count them. What the novel is describing is that the prince finds satisfaction in having places yet unexplored in his own home. And that's more of a spiritual sentiment than a materialistic one. It's not about numbers. It's obviously only a spiritual sentiment that the materialistically endowed can express, but still it shows that in this moment, even though they sound a little similar, the novel and the miniseries are expressing different things about the prince. Angelica and Tancredi, they set out on these adventures to explore the house with other people, but they very quickly lose them to be on their own. They would also playfully lose each other, hide and be found again. Note this is very different than literally playing hide and seek as in the miniseries. And while there were caresses and sensual feelings, they were moments ecstatic and painful, during which desire became a torment, restraint upon it a delight. That element of restraint is what keeps the tension active between the two of them. They entered one apartment where Tancredi, disturbed, would not let Angelica touch a cupboard in the drawing room wall and opened it himself. It was deep, but empty, except for a roll of dirty stuff standing upright in a corner. Inside was a bundle of small whips, switches of bull's muscle, some with silver handles, others wrapped halfway up in a charming old silk, white, with little blue stripes, on which could be seen 3 rows of blackish marks, and metal instruments for inexplicable purposes. Tancredi was afraid, also of himself. "Let's go, my dear, there's nothing interesting here." So we had this room in the miniseries as well, and you'll recall that it inspired the memorable eye licking. And we have here a study in opposites. So there in the miniseries, the room inspires them to jump into something. Here in the novel, the room leads them to jump back. And I find this jumping back much more interesting. As mentioned before, the element of restraint keeps the sexual tension active between the two of them. And also, how surprising is it to see something that the confident Tancredi is frightened of? And as the novel describes, it's something potentially about himself that he's frightened of. You think about how two people in love start to open up to each other and be known to each other. And then they suddenly reveal something that goes too far, something they're not ready for yet. It's a beautiful disturbance, very realistically depicted here by Lampedusa. And it shows them as simultaneously innocent and not so innocent. They leave the room in the novel, and I have no idea the extent of depravity Tancredi is capable of. He doesn't even know. And that's dangerous, and that's interesting. And on they would go exploring the rooms. Those were the best days in the lives of Tancredi and Angelica. Lives later to be so variegated, so erring, against the inevitable background of sorrow. But of that they were still unaware, in their pursuit of a future which they deemed more concrete than it turned out to be, made of nothing but smoke and wind. Those days were the preparation for a marriage which, even erotically, was no success. A preparation, however, in a way sufficient to itself, exquisite and brief, like those overtures which outlive the forgotten operas they belonged to, and hint in delicate veiled gaiety at all the arias which later in the opera are to be developed undeftly and fail. I mentioned before how underrated I thought the role of humor was in the tone of the novel. Here we encounter another key element of the tone of the novel, which I think of as forgiveness. Even as it stares unflinchingly into these characters, sees clearly their fates, it forgives the characters and forgives fate. One might think the value of a life is where it ends up, but the novel is able to say, look at this beautiful overture and let its memory live, because it can forgive all the rest. We learn next that Cavriaghi's courtship of Concetta has not been going well. Tancredi did, in fact, bring him here to try to transfer his cousin's feelings for him to his friend, but this is never spoken aloud the way it is in the miniseries. Cavriaghi talks dramatically about his broken heart, but he seems to bounce back again, as 19-year-olds are known to do. The prince one day receives a letter announcing the visit of Chevalier, the secretary of the prefecture. There aren't a lot of details, but it says that he wishes to come and discuss with the prince a matter of importance to the national government. Now, Chevalier, as a man from the north, has a very funny time of it in Sicily. His head had been stuffed with the tales of brigands by which Sicilians love to test the nervous resistance of new arrivals. And for a month he had seen every usher in his office as a murderer, and every wooden paper cutter on his desk as a dagger. For a month, too, the oily cooking had upset his inside. He arrives in Donna Fugata, and he did not dare to ask the way from any of the peasants, propped against the walls like caryatids. In his certainty of not being understood, and his fear of a gratuitous knife in the guts, still dear to him, however upset. When Francesco Paolo came up and introduced himself, he screwed up his eyes at first as he thought himself done for. But the fair-haired youth's calm, honest air reassured him a little. And when he realized that he was being invited to stay with the Selina, he was both surprised and relieved. When he arrives at the palace, his fears flip into a different kind of terror, as he has never been a guest in such a great house before, of such luxury. When they speak the next afternoon, Chevalier reveals that the prince's name has come up in the list of illustrious persons that they would like to nominate to represent Sicily in the National Senate. This was because of the great heritage of his name, his scientific achievements, and also his liberal attitude towards recent events. Before sending this list to Turin, his superiors wanted to know if the prince approved, as they all hoped he did. The prince thinks to himself, "This fellow here seems to be under the impression he's come to do me a great honor. To me, who am what I am, among other things, a peer of the kingdom of Sicily, which must be more or less the same as a senator. It's true that one must value gifts in relation to those who offer them. When a peasant gives me his bit of cheese, he's making a bigger present than the Prince of Lascari when he invites me to dinner. That's obvious. The difficulty is that the cheese is nauseating. So all that remains is the heart's gratitude, which can't be seen, and the nose wrinkled in disgust, which can be seen only too well. His thoughts cycle a little more, thinking of the time Caligula made his horse a senator. He asked Chevalier what being a senator entails. But Prince, the Senate is the high chamber of the kingdom. In it, the flower of Italy's politicians, picked by the wisdom of the sovereign, will examine, discuss, approve or disapprove the laws proposed by the government for the progress of the country. It functions at the same time as spur and brake. It incites good actions and prevents bad ones. When you have accepted a seat in it, you will represent Sicily on an equality with the other elected deputies. You will make us hear the voice of this lovely country, which is only now sighting the modern world, with so many wounds to heal, so many just desires to be granted. You can imagine the range of people these words would motivate. You can also imagine the prince comfortably outside that range. And Lampedusa has the funniest way of expressing where these ideas rate for the prince. Chevalier would perhaps have continued for some time in this tone if Bendico from behind the door had not asked the wisdom of his sovereign to admit him. The prince tells Chevalier that if this were just a ceremonial title, he would be happy to accept. He explains, "We Sicilians have become accustomed, by a very long hegemony of rulers, who were not of our religion and did not speak our language, to split hairs. If we had not done so, we'd never have coped with Byzantine tax gatherers, with Berber emirs, with Spanish viceroys. In these last 6 months since your Garibaldi set foot at Marsala, too many things have been started without our being consulted, for you now to ask a member of the old governing class to help develop them and carry them through. I do not wish to discuss now if what was done was good or bad. For my part, I believe much of it to have been bad. But I'd like to tell you at once what you only understand after spending a year among us. In Sicily, it doesn't matter about doing things well or badly. The sin which we Sicilians never forgive is simply that of doing at all. We are old, Chevalier, very old. For over 25 centuries, we've been bearing the weight of superb and heterogeneous civilizations. All from outside, none made by ourselves, one that we could call our own. Sleep, my dear Chevalier, sleep. That is what Sicilians want, and they will always hate anyone who tries to wake them, even in order to bring them the most wonderful of gifts. I must say, between ourselves, that I have strong doubts whether the new kingdom will have many gifts for us in its luggage. All Sicilian self-expression, even the most violent, is really wish fulfillment. Our sensuality is a hankering for oblivion. Our shooting and knifing a hankering for death. This is the cause of the well-known time lag of a century in our artistic and intellectual life. Novelties attract us only when they are dead, incapable of arousing vital currents. This disturbs Chevalier, and you can see how, ever since the novel was published, this has also disturbed and offended some Sicilians. And the prince continues on with his ideological inferno. I said Sicilians, I should have added Sicily. The atmosphere, the climate, the landscape of Sicily. Those are the forces which have formed our minds, together with, and perhaps more than, alien pressure and varied invasion. This landscape, which knows no mean between sensuous sag and hellish drought, which is never petty, never ordinary, never relaxed, as should be a country made for rational beings to live in. This country of ours, in which the inferno around Randazzo is a few miles from the beauty of Taormina Bay. This climate which inflicts us with 6 feverish months at a temperature of 104. Count them, Chevalier, count them. May, June, July, August, September, October, 6 times 30 days of sun, sheer down on our heads. This summer of ours, which is as long and glum as the Russian winter, and against which we struggle with less success. You don't know it yet, but fire could be said to snow down on us, as on the accursed cities of the Bible. If a Sicilian worked hard in any of those months, he would expend energy enough for 3. Then water is either lacking altogether, or has to be carried from so far that every drop is paid for by a drop of sweat. And when the rains come, they're always tempestuous, and set dry torrents to frenzy, drown beasts and men on the very spot where 2 weeks before both had been dying of thirst. This violence of landscape, this cruelty of climate, this continual tension in everything, and even these monuments of the past, magnificent yet incomprehensible because not built by us, and yet standing round us like lovely, mute ghosts. All those rulers who landed by main force from all directions, who were at once obeyed, soon detested and always misunderstood. Their sole means of expression, works of art, we found enigmatic, and taxes we found only too intelligible, and which they spent elsewhere. All these things have formed our character, which is thus conditioned by events outside our control, as well as by terrifying insularity of mind. The prince then more explicitly declines the offer. I am most grateful to the government for having thought of me for the Senate, and I ask you to express my most sincere gratitude to them, but I cannot accept. I'm a member of the old ruling class, inevitably compromised by the Bourbon regime, and bound to it by chains of decency, if not of affection. I belong to an unlucky generation, swung between the old world and the new, and I find myself ill at ease in both. And what is more, as you have probably realized by now, I am without illusions. And what would the Senate do with me? An inexperienced legislator who lacks the faculty of self-deception, essential requisite for anybody wanting to guide others. The prince then goes on to recommend Siddhartha instead as senator. Chevalier appeals again to the prince. Remember, this was his mission in coming here, to get the prince to accept. And he appeals to the ideal of improving life for Sicilians. The prince responds that the Sicilians never want to improve for the simple reason that they think themselves perfect. Their vanity is stronger than their misery. Every invasion by outsiders, whether so by origin or, if Sicilian, by independence of spirit, upsets their illusions of achieved perfection, risks disturbing their satisfied waiting for nothing. Having been trampled on by a dozen different peoples, they think they have an imperial past, which gives them a right to a grand funeral. The next morning, Chevalier leaves, and the prince and Don Ciccio accompany him to the post station as they're setting out for their hunting. The description of the streets and their thoughts is a perfect extension of the prince's pontifications of the day before. So allow me to quote this last page of the chapter in full. In the livid light of 5:30 in the morning, Donna Fugata was deserted and seemed despairing. In front of every house, the refuse of squalid meals accumulated along leprous walls. Trembling dogs were routing about with a greed that was always disappointed. An occasional door was already open, and the cumulative stench of sleep spread out into the street. By glimmering wicks, mothers scrutinized the lids of their children for trachoma. Almost all were in mourning, and many had been the wives of those carcasses one stumbles over on the turns of mountain tracks. The men were coming out gripping their hoes to look for someone who might give them work, God willing. Subdued silence alternated with exacerbated screams of hysterical voices. Away towards the convent of the Holy Ghost, a tinny dawn was beginning to tinge leaden clouds. Chevalier thought, this state of things won't last. Our lively new modern administration will change it all. The prince was depressed. All this shouldn't last, but it will always. The human always, of course. A century, 2 centuries. And after that it will be different, but worse. We were the leopards and lions. Those who'll take our place will be little jackals, hyenas. And the whole lot of us, leopards, jackals, and sheep, will all go on thinking ourselves the salt of the earth. They thanked each other and said goodbye. Chevalier hoisted himself up on the post-carriage, propped on 4 wheels the color of vomit. The horse, all hunger and sores, began its long journey. Day had just dawned. The little light that managed to pass through quilted clouds was held up once more by the immemorial filth on the windows. Chevalier was alone. Amid bumps and shakes, he moistened the tip of his index finger with saliva and cleaned a pane for the width of an eye. He looked out. In front of him, under the ashen light, the landscape lurched to and fro. Irredeemable. Insanely beautiful. There's enough here to discuss for days. The idea of describing the dirt that accumulates on a vehicle's window as immemorial filth, and the idea that each waking day is just wiping off enough of this immemorial filth to get an eyes-width view of an irredeemable world. What an end to Chapter 4. A reminder of where we were with the Visconti film. It had followed the novel pretty faithfully, and we had our day of hunting, full of gossip about the plebiscite voting and about the Sidaras. The prince then conveyed Tancredi's proposal to Sidara, and then we ended the day by letting Don Ciccio out of the gunroom. Next, the film picks up with the prince in one of his evening readings to the family. And this production design is so wonderful. Let's take a few moments just to live in this room for a bit. I'm going to start by pointing out some characteristics we've discussed in the past. Notice how every surface is just chock full of design. The tiled floor with the many carpets, the marble surface of the table on the right, the marble base molding where the floor meets the wall on the left, the fabrics on the backs of chairs like tapestries, the layered details of every costume, two tones to the intricate wallpaper, and picture frames of every kind. We see again how deep focus lets us appreciate all the details, as well as the scale of the room. There's a beautiful color balance with clear whites and blues and purples, balancing out the real intense warmth of the room. The objects that the women are working with, they're really wonderful to see. And the distribution of objects feels very real. A teacup on a book, a basket on top of a box. Now some new things to notice. Do you see how well lit all the faces are to the right of the prince? Skin tones are realistic, and the white light does so much to keep the shot from sinking into darkness. We're going to discuss more this painting technique called chiaroscuro in a later video. But for right now, just notice how those bright spots of faces and the two lamps give an architectural structure to the shot. And finally, something that always makes me smile when I see this scene is that it looks like a battlefield between circles and lines. You see it most obviously in the picture frames, but then you see it in the backs of chairs, then in tabletops, then in lamps versus the fireplace. You start to see it in the painting subjects, faces versus architectural columns. You start to see it in the characters' bodies and in the flower arrangement. And that's how you know it's time to move on. So recall it's a night of thunderstorms. And I love how the servant has to go through all these rooms to get to the family to tell them that Tancredi is coming. And here he is. The dialogue that follows is very loyal to the novel. Prince asks, "Weren't you wearing red shirts?" Tancredi explains he's part of the real army now. Cavriaghi says people aren't afraid they'll steal their chickens anymore. Some of you may recognize this actor as Terence Hill, known for his movies with Bud Spencer. They were both Italians, but they took on American names to help sell their movies. Tancredi shows everyone the ring he got for Angelica. Concetta and Cavriaghi have their moment as he presents her with the book of poems. But then here comes Angelica's entrance.
Posso? Chiedo perdono, ho saputo che...
That deserves a ring. Here they are, later on, exploring the palace together. That pink dress on her is perfect. It's like she's blushing the whole time. And it so easily lifts her from any background they could possibly encounter. Look at this next to how Angelica is presented in the same scene in the miniseries. Even though Claudia Cardinale is a good 5 years older than Deva Cassel when they each filmed these roles, Claudia has the innocence and promise of youth about her that I think is essential for this moment in Angelica's life and for the story. And we feel this from the writing, the directing, the acting, but also the design of the film. I'm going to play a few moments of them exploring and hiding from each other. I love how much the rooms each have their own personality that's awakened by the young couple.
Tancredi. Tancredi, dove sei?
You may have seen this image before of Claudia Cardinale against this giant painting. It's absolutely striking. It feels like they're exploring the land of giants and ghosts. They run into Cavriaghi. He tells them how he's getting nowhere with Concetta, even with these stunning blue eyes. So he's leaving. Angelica and Tancredi explore more rooms. They get to the room with the whips, but here in the movie, they're spoken of in the abstract. We never see them. And it's spoken of as a place Tancredi's ancestors came to break the rules. And more importantly, it's a place that is already known to Tancredi. So we lose one of the really surprising moments in the novel, where we get to see Tancredi flinch a little. A nervous Chevalier arrives in town, and Francesco Paolo goes to meet him. As they go into the palace, Concetta and Cavariaghi watch them. They have nothing to say to each other, but we do get this nice pan out of the moment. It's gorgeous. I'm not sure I've ever seen a perspective on a town like this. The prince meets Chevalier, and I love how he towers over him in this shot. Chevalier is eager to talk business, but the prince says no, cards first. When they do talk business, we're back in the prince's office. That's the same chair Siddhartha sat in when they discussed Tancredi's marriage proposal. But we never got a close-up like this, so I could never really appreciate the details before. Chevalier, using the words of the novel, lets it be known that the government would like the prince to serve in the Senate. The prince asks, what does it mean to be a senator? As Chevalier makes his case for the importance of the Senate, Burt Lancaster does some tremendous acting. In his silence, and even with this slightly closed-off posture, we're able to experience the prince's mind space. And when he does speak, it is both deeply felt and understated. You truly do feel these are the views of one left with no more self-delusion. So there are no real narrative surprises in this scene. Pretty much all the dialogue comes from the novel. But I'd like to take a few moments to watch how Visconti develops the scene visually. The first part takes place at the table, and then he has the prince get up. Then he takes this almost gallows-like walk to take his place at the end of this line of portraits. And I've talked about how much I love Burt Lancaster's performance in this scene, but a performance means nothing without understanding how to see it. And Visconti gives such a beautiful and dynamic perspective on the performance. We're at the fireplace, and what a beautiful development from the desk. Looking up at him, we have fuller access to his eyes. Then to sink the face into a kind of shadow, a deeply poetic alignment with his words. And now to sit into a fireside confession. You can understand why Lancaster loved this film and loved Visconti so much. He understood how to see Burt Lancaster's performance and how to align it with his own wonderful elements. And you've seen how frequently singles in the Visconti film allow you to see a lot of detail in the background. When the scene started at the desk, you could see a lot in the background. But notice how it turns a little more abstract as the scene progresses, allowing us to focus more and more on just the prince and his thoughts. Abstraction and low-density backgrounds can be a beautiful tool if you're very aware of changes in how you use them. And notice that when we come back to Chevalier, we see detailed backgrounds again. We're pulled out of the prince's mind space a little. And when we come back to the prince, you see how we've mixed worlds a little. It's still abstract, but not as isolated as before, and a step towards Chevalier's shot. Then the conversation turns more practical, and the prince recommends Siddhartha for senator. But lest you think the film has run out of perspectives for this scene, they just keep coming and coming, and the scene deserves it. But it also makes you realize how sadly unimaginative the standard shot, reverse shot coverage we've grown accustomed to is. The next morning, when Chevalier leaves at dawn, we get this early morning walk through Donna Fugata. Kudos to the movie for just letting this wordless scene play out. At the carriage, we get the prince's line, "We were the leopards, the lions." Chevalier does not understand, but no matter, goodbye. And we don't get the business with the window, but we do get this fabulous wave. And there ends the film's treatment of Chapter 4. We've reached the 2-hour and 16-minute mark, so we spent about 36 minutes in Chapter 4. It's the longest chapter in the book, and I think the film has done it justice. So on to the miniseries. Recall that when we last left the series, the prince had asked Sidara for Angelica's hand in marriage on behalf of Tancredi. Concetta finds out and is furious at her father. The plebiscite then takes place. Now I'm going to move pretty quickly through 2 episodes of the miniseries, since they have minimal overlap with the events of the novel or the movie. We start with the title, Palermo 1861. And you'll see we're already in a different place and timeline than Chapter 4, which was in Donofugata, November 1860. So Tancredi and Angelica are getting married, and it's a lovely location, grotesquely photographed. We've already covered in part 1 the technical elements of this aesthetic, but notice how here they're taken to the point where no one looks human. No one has human skin. And this is the aesthetic I've come to expect from something like AI. But if you're going to bother to assemble all these real humans in a real location, I really have no idea why you would photograph them to such an artificial effect. It's time for gifts. The prince gives Angelica a necklace gifted to his mother by King Ferdinand I. Concetta is not happy about that. Sidara gives Tancredi a horse from the farm of Queen Isabel of Spain. Tancredi asks what her name is. Sidara says you get to name her. Tancredi says, let's call her the Joy of Donofugata. Cesco holds Concetta's hand through this terrible naming. Angelica tells Concetta that she and Tancredi are going to live in Turin, as he's gotten a position in the new government. Concetta decides that she has to go somewhere too, and it's to the convent. The coldness of this setting is then juxtaposed with the warmth of Tancredi and Angelica's wedding night. The way they walk towards each other feels more like a duel than lovemaking. The prince learns by letter from the Mother Superior that Concetta has gone to the convent. He burns the letter. But he misses Concetta, and with her birthday coming up, he prepares a little gift for her. His wife sees him leaving and says, "Promise me you won't go see Concetta. She needs a chance to live her spiritual life." He says, "I promise I won't visit her. I'll make Father Pirone do it." Father Pirone can't convince her to come home, but leaves the present with her. Later, Concetta opens it to find it is a telescope. The note says, "Which end do you want to look through? The one that makes the world look big, or the one that makes it look small?" I actually do really like this moment. It gets to the heart of the prince's worries, that she's shrinking from life. And he uses the scientific instrument that is most meaningful to him. Seems like a very dad thing to do. The prince meets Sidara, who tells him about this opportunity to buy up church property cheap, and that they can make a killing because it has sulfur deposits. An indignant prince says that with his daughter Concetta now a bride of Christ, he won't be the one to turn church property into a hellish inferno. Note, this is contrary to the prince of the novel, who even solicits Sidara's help regarding business matters, and develops a kind of respect for his way of doing things, so free of the restraints the prince feels. And that's because the leopard of the novel understands that this is the way of the world now, and that it no longer belongs to people like him. So that's the leopard we lose. Who is the leopard we gain in this series? Is this refusal a moral act? It seems to want to portray itself this way, but I have a hard time understanding it as such. We've already learned from Ciccio how the mayor has earned all his wealth and estates. This proposal is perfectly in line with that past. And the prince has allowed Sidara to contribute all those estates to the marriage contract and allowed Tancredi and his family to be tied to all these activities. There's no distancing himself now. Is it a matter of the church? To me, that seems unlikely. He's shown no signs of being particularly devout. He takes his priest with him to visit his mistress. He's upset with the Mother Superior. He's trying to get his daughter out of the convent. So religion as motivation makes no sense. So what is this? It's moral indignation without moral sense. I think this problem is extremely prevalent in contemporary dramatic writing. How often have you watched a television show where a character suddenly believes something wholeheartedly, so much so that it leads them to charge into a new course of action, and you have no idea where it came from? And if any character happened to question this belief, its logic would just fall apart instantly. It's moral indignation without moral sense. We owe it to our characters that if their emotions are to heighten, this should make sense for the character. As Concetta and the sisters are distributing alms to the poor, She spots a prostitute and is compelled to approach her and say, "I want to know what your life is like." Not sure which end of the telescope she's looking through here. This is the prince's mistress, and only if Concetta knows this do I see any sense of her approaching so insistently like this. We'll see if that's the case. The prince's eldest son, Paolo, comes riding in on Tancredi's horse. The prince says, "You're going to ride out with Russo to make the rounds of the estates. If these are going to be yours one day, you're going to have to learn to care for them." Then there's this really long embrace where the prince tells him not to forget he is his heir. So let's think through what's going on here. First, let's think about the significance of the prince calling his son his heir. While there were a mix of systems of inheritance in place in Sicily in the 19th century, the novel makes it clear that in the Selina family, there will be a division of the estate. It won't be equal, but there will be division. So while Paolo's inheritance will likely be largest, each sibling can theoretically see after themselves. But there are two other types of inheritance for Paolo outside of property. He's going to inherit the prince's role in the aristocracy, and he will inherit a role at the center of the family. With these comes the responsibility of representing the aristocracy well and defending the general interests of the family. In the novel, the prince does not believe Paolo capable of these tasks. That's why he has invested so much effort and hope in Tancredi. But nonetheless, he's going to continue to see that Paolo gets the best education possible, and he's still going to be attentive to try to lead Paolo onto surer and better paths. He will give him tasks to reflect his developing responsibilities. Recall in chapter 1 how when Garibaldi landed at Marsala, the prince sends Paolo to look after the home in Palermo. But deluding himself into thinking Paolo can suddenly sprout the talent to be a strong defender of the aristocracy and the family would only endanger both. That's what Tancredi's for. So that's the novel. Here in the miniseries, we have some changes. First of all, treating Tancredi as a problem the prince has to deal with, rather than a hope for the future, that really throws a wrench in the works. Without Tancredi and with the limits of Paolo, and so far the little we've seen in the series of the prince and Paolo's relationship is that it's antagonistic and disapproving, the prince really is in a bind. What's he going to do with his legacy? So here in episode 4, it is his first day on Earth to play the succession game, and he suddenly remembers he has a son, suddenly displays a great deal of affection, this embrace is over 10 seconds long, and wishes to mold him into someone who can care for the family. It's like waking up one day and deciding you're going to mold your 16-year-old son into a professional athlete. Good luck. It's really hard to understate how big a change this is. In the novel, in the movie, succession and the future is all that is on the prince's mind. And a large part of why he's so emotionally invested in Tancredi and subsequently in the marriage to Angelica. Here in the miniseries, succession enters halfway into the story. The prince is not someone with this one continuous cloud hanging over him the whole while, like in the novel. Instead, he's someone just reflexively responding to things moment by moment, out of petulance and panic. And inheritance is just another one of those moments. And in fact, this all does look reflexive, as though with Concetta not talking to him, he just needs contact with one of his children, and so he transfers his attentions onto Paolo. And like we experienced before with this series, it makes this moment all about the prince's own feelings, rather than about the prince's broader project of seeing to the strategic welfare of the family. So as Paolo is setting out with Russo, the prince tells him he can take Tancredi's horse, and Paolo charges out, making giddy-up sounds like a little boy. It's ridiculous. Russo agrees. Then look who shows up at the convent. It is Marianina, the prince's mistress, the woman who Concetta ran up to on the street and whose life Concetta was so eager to know. Marianina mentions how Concetta seems to have a lot of influence for a novice. She says, "My father is Prince of Selina." Marianina doesn't seem surprised in the least. So at least we're certain she knows who Concetta is. They have a heated conversation about love and prostitution, and Marianina is insulted and starts to leave. Concetta apologizes and asks if she will come again. Marianina says no, but Concetta is free to visit her if she's so curious about her life. Meanwhile, the prince is missing Concetta, so he sniffs her perfume, looks through her drawings. He must go see her. And this is as ridiculously childish as Paolo. Perhaps in the world of this series, it is conceivable that Paolo is a passable heir to the prince, because this prince has no real strategic ability. He's all reflexes and whims. He says, I want to see my daughter. She says no. He threatens her. She says no. He leaves. Absolutely useless. So back to Paolo. He feels the estate is yielding too little and wants to have a talk with the tenants. Russo doesn't want him to do this, so he distracts him with lunch. Russo sneaks away, and apparently he is in cahoots with Sidara. Paolo discovers them together. He says, what's going on? Russo, why are you kneeling before someone who's not my father? Sidara says, we're old friends. Sidara then distracts him with lunch. He tells Paolo about the sulfur deposit beneath the church property, trying to entice him into the deal when he couldn't do so with the prince. It's not clear to me why he's doing this. There's nothing he needs from Paolo, and this could not be looked upon well by the prince. And I have no idea why Sidara would want to create ill will with the prince. Recall in the novel, these are days they unexpectedly grow closer. Concetta visits Marianina. Marianina, in the middle of the day, decides to light some candles right in the pool of sunlight. Continuing her charm offensive, Concetta asks Marianina how old she is, how long she thinks she can keep up this life of prostitution. Concetta says, come with me to my house. Marianina says, the convent is not your house. Your house has 100 halls. Concetta says, that's not my house. That's my father's house. Marianina then opens a door, revealing her father's clothes, and says, sometimes this is your father's house also. Concetta is not happy with the sight, but she's also not shocked. So she's known who this is all along. Now that there's no more pretending, Marianina can plead on the prince's part for Concetta to return to him. Very compassionately, she reveals she knows the story of her and Tancredi, and tries to convince Concetta that there are more possibilities of love awaiting her in the world, not to shrivel away from life. Meanwhile, Paolo and company have arrived at the sulfur mine. It's currently run by bandits, but Paolo wants to inspect it. This guy says, why don't you inspect my asshole while you're at it? Literally, that's what he says. Russo says, let's go, Paolo. We can come back with more people. Paolo says, Sidara, give me 2 of your bodyguards. Sidara says, sure. You go on ahead. My old lungs can't take this. Paolo demands, in the name of his father, that they let him inspect the mine. Russo tries to talk him back. Paolo calls Russo a coward and giddy-ups again. A whole line of men with guns tells Paolo to stop. A whole line of men with guns tells him to stop, but he doesn't. A shot is fired, and his horse is startled, and we cut out of the scene to the prince and Marianina. He finds Concetta's book in her home. He's furious at Concetta for meddling in his life, furious at Marianina as well. He goes banging at the door of the convent. He sees Concetta at the window. He walks away. Absolutely useless. The prince comes home to find Chevalier. In his bad mood, he dismisses him and says they'll talk tomorrow. The next day, the prince is in a much better mood. And strangely, he starts discussing business with Chevalier at meal with the rest of the family. When Chevalier hesitates, the prince says, I have no secrets from my family. Oh, what an absurd line. Of course he does. And there are children at the table. He's keeping secrets all the time. He deceives his wife when he goes to see Concetta or Marianina. And what purpose does it serve to talk business and official government matters at the dining table? It would hardly be protocol in a house like this. And the prince should know that it would distort the nature of the conversation. One can speak far more freely before an audience of one. But here we go, asking the prince to be a senator at the dining table. It turns into a family conversation with Cesco and the princess chiming in. I guess this is all very modern, but that's a problem for a story centered around a character who's supposed to be a relic of the past. In any case, the conversation doesn't get far as news is rushed in about Paolo. Russo says it was the horse. I'm going to let you guess what the prince does next. Recall the pattern we've seen in this series, where he acts by emotional reflex to the most fruitless outcomes. The prince reacts to Russo saying it was the horse by shooting the horse. It is shoot first, ask questions never. Because I have plenty of questions. For example, how? That might be a good starting point for understanding who's to blame. How exactly did Paolo die? What spooked the horse? Why does he immediately believe Russo? He knows he's capable of lying. And I have questions as a spectator. Why did Sadara so intentionally set the boy out on such a dangerous path where he knew he would come to harm? Would he do something so extreme just to hide his relationship with Russo? Is this somehow to harm the prince's household? The kind of malevolence this, or pretty much any explanation implies, really catapults Sadara to a level of villainy that seems to belong in a different story. Yes, there are rumors that Sadara had his troublesome father-in-law shot, but that was decades ago. The current rumors are only about business dealings. And to disturb the house his daughter is about to marry into in this way alienates him as a character for me, because this becomes his defining action, and I can't understand it at all. Paolo's funeral brings Tancredi back, and it brings Concetta back. She embraces her father. Tancredi takes her hand. Anyone getting the feeling that none of this is about Paolo? In the book, he does die of a riding accident, but that's years later, and that was an accident, no more. Here, it has been transposed into circumstances that make Sadara incomprehensible to me, and his death seems not some incident in his own story, but placed here to advance the story of others. I find it unkind to treat a character's life and death with such casualness. It ends an episode of almost pure invention, virtually without parallel to the novel, whose sense is not yet apparent. Let's move on to episode 5 of the series, August 1862. So this is over a year after the last episode started. Time has passed, and it seems Concetta is still at home. Her mother asks her to accompany her father to Turin, where he will give his answer about whether or not he'll accept the offer to become a senator. Concetta says, "No, I can't bear to see Tancredi again." Her mother says, "Please, your father hasn't been well since Paolo died." Concetta tells her father she will accompany him to Turin. So let's first discuss the fact that the prince has not yet responded to the offer. Recall that in the novel and the film, except for this reflective pause in the conversation, he pretty much gave his response immediately, that unless it was just ceremonial, he didn't have the drive to participate. In the series, the proposal was interrupted by Paolo's death, but for the prince not to give an answer for so long, and to now make a trip to Turin to give his response in person, shows that he's at least taking this seriously, and that's something he didn't do in the novel or the film. Next, I can only assume that Princess Stella told Concetta something else about her father that we don't witness. Maybe something specifically about his declining health, because it's obvious no one in the house is doing well after Paolo's death. That's not new information. So I would expect more substantial information is needed to change Concetta's mind. This is really the first good look we've gotten at one of the prince's study rooms in the series. So I'd like to do a quick comparison between a still from the film and the series. The film is at Donofugata and the series is presumably at Palermo, but that's not particularly important. So we can quickly review some of the aesthetic patterns we've already discussed. We see the limited color range in the top image, where everything is a version of brown. We see the diffusion and bright windows that are characteristic of the series. Now let's take it a step further and talk about how each image uses brightness. In the top image, the bright spots are all around Concetta. The window, the kick of light off the desk, the bright sleeve. They have the effect of emphasizing her body position. And the light patterns in this shot don't draw attention to either of the characters' faces. In the bottom image, I would note 3 key bright spots, 2 faces and the lamp. The lamp is the brightest spot, but note that because it's a pretty contained point of light and it's at the edge of frame, it doesn't draw our attention in the way the broad central brightness in the upper image does. Chevalet's face is brighter than the prince's, but note that this is because of context. He's in a brighter area of the room, so more brightness makes sense. At the same time, you need a little more brightness to lift him out of his surroundings. The prince's face is not as bright, but it's in a darker area of the room, where there's no competition for attention. The aesthetics of the top image are meant to create a mood, and it does so by emphasizing exterior elements to the characters. The bottom image also has external elements contributing to the mood, but it doesn't dominate the scene. The shot is set up to be able to access the internal life of the characters as well. And it never ends. They get to Turin, and characters' faces are constantly deprioritized. Angelica shares news that Tancredi is being considered for a diplomatic role at the Italian embassy in Paris. Tancredi tells the prince, "I'd appreciate your support." Again, this would be unthinkable in the novel, that the prince would be that out of the loop on these matters. The Tancredi of the novel would have told and consulted the prince before anybody else. They go to the opera that night, where they meet the French ambassador, and look who else is here. Bombello. Recall he's the colonel who helped them with the permit to travel to Donna Fugata in exchange for a dance with Concetta. During the opera, there's a whole lot of staring going on. The prince stares at Concetta, Concetta stares at the prince, Tancredi stares at Concetta, Concetta stares at Tancredi. I do like that during the opera, the lights stay up. One of the main reasons for going to the opera at the time was to be seen, and dimming the lights was a practice that would come along later. There's news during the opera that Garibaldi has returned with his troops, disobeying an order from the king. This is the new king heading the Turin government that Tancredi is part of. The French ambassador is not happy about this, but Angelica calms him down by speaking French. I think having her speak French is supposed to show how educated she is, but really all these nobles in this age speak French. The scene may also show how she uses the power of her looks to help engineer political outcomes. Conceptually, it's an interesting step towards the future Angelica that the novel hints at, the one who becomes a manipulative political animal. But this scene doesn't leave much of an impression. And I think understanding how Angelica transitions to her political awareness and power, that's what's interesting. And this scene doesn't offer any insights into that. The prince visits the Senate house. They're still hoping he accepts. Apparently, he hasn't given an answer yet. Bombello pays Concetta a visit, and before discussing the content of their conversation, I'll point out this is, again, one of those scenes with extremely shallow focus. So just the people are in focus and their environments are completely out of focus. This extreme difference, again, it has the effect that they look like cutouts or that they're shot against green screen. Bombello asks how long Concetta will be in Turin. Both of them are visiting, neither of them lives here. She says it depends on her father. They get into a conversation where we learn that Bombello is not a fan of the current government that Tancredi is part of. This government that isn't a republic, that has a king. Concetta asks why he's not still fighting alongside Garibaldi then. He says his fighting days are over. He wants to live life. He asks if he can visit her again before she leaves Turin. She says yes, but ask my father first next time. As Concetta is getting ready for a party for her father, Tancredi comes in and tells her, "It hasn't been easy seeing you again." She says, "What, you think it's easy for me to see you again?" In case you've been watching another screen and haven't noticed they're uncomfortable seeing each other again, they've said it out loud for you. At the party, there's an announcement that Garibaldi's been defeated. So naturally, they all toast the prince. At the party, Angelica does this little trick that Tancredi has taught her. This is something we learn in a later chapter in the book. He tells her that when appraising art, one should praise some quality, but then note that some other piece of art is a much better example of this quality. What this does is it shows that you have appreciation for art while not making you seem like a simpleton, impressed by the first thing you see. It's hard to convey this whole backstory, so the miniseries just has her say those two sentences: praise, comparison. And it's not just the backstory we're missing. We don't see the context that leads her to employ this technique. We also don't see the effect of these lines on the people she's talking to, because we cut away from her in the middle of the line. It's very hard to empathize with her character's trajectory, because rather than living through any of these scenes with her, she seems to just drop in for a line or two. I feel like we could understand her much better if there were some scenes with just her and Tancredi, or just more developed moments between the two of them. Remember, the last time we saw them before these Turin scenes was on their wedding night. It's been a while. Tancredi tells Concetta, "I need to talk to you, but not in front of all these people. Meet me at this address." Concetta goes to the address, and surprise, it's Tassoni, one of Tancredi's old soldier friends, who answers the door. Concetta learns that it's Tassoni's place, and Tancredi just uses it to meet secretly with women. All night, the princes notice the close attention Angelica has paid to the French ambassador, and so the prince follows her from the party and sees the two of them together. He confronts her. Apparently, both she and Tancredi have been sleeping around. The conversation turns heated, and the prince says, "Promise me this won't happen again." This is one of those TV lines of dialogue when you just need to fill the air with sound, and you can't be bothered thinking about your characters. Their conversation is going terribly. Why would she promise anything to someone she's arguing with? Why isn't he actually responding to any of the things she's talking about? And would a promise of hers actually be worth anything? She, of course, promises no such thing and just leaves. Tancredi arrives. He says, I had to see you. My marriage to Angelica was a marriage of lust and money, and now all we have in common is ambition. I spend my days wondering what life with you would have been like. Concetta walks away. Well, she still needs a ride home, but then she walks away. The prince sits Tancredi down. He tells him, your wife is having an affair with the French ambassador. Tancredi says, it's all good. It's all under control. The prince is shocked Tancredi consented to this. Tancredi says, as far as I can remember, you've always had a lover. The prince threatens to bash his head in. Recall that the prince of the novel does not lift a finger against anyone. He had his little moment of anger with Ciccio, but that led to a clenched fist and nothing more. And I criticized the film for turning it into something more. And I criticized the miniseries here for resorting to violence. Like in life, when violence can be the only recourse for an empty soul, here violence betrays the emptiness of this prince. Why should I follow this mess of animal instincts scene to scene? Do you recall that in the novel, Tancredi was a man of such subtlety and discretion? He would write the prince a letter and know where to break to a new page so that the prince could show different parts of the letter to different audiences. And the prince was so in tune with Tancredi that he could pick up on this. Those were fascinating, original characters I cared to follow. Yes, adaptation gives you the choice to deviate from this. But if your process is to excise the richness and insert baseness, I have the choice to find it useless. The next morning, before the prince is set to give his speech about whether he'll serve in the Senate, he makes this confession to Concetta, and I'm going to quote directly here. He says, it's not easy, you know, reaching my age and realizing you got everything wrong. Tancredi has always had my love, and look what he has become. Whereas Paolo always had to earn it, and in trying to do so, he met his death. And it was all my fault, even though no one has the courage to say so. So I've already expressed how deep I find the losses from changing Tancredi's relationship with the prince. For the moment, I'm going to put that aside and just evaluate the prince's statement purely in the world of the miniseries. The first problem here is that his love for Tancredi is spoken about, but it's never observed or understood. Similarly, we never really understand where his frustrations with Paolo come from. We just see him being harsh with someone who comes across as pretty reasonable, with the exception of the decisions in the scene leading up to his death. So in a way, we can agree with him that his love for Tancredi and his harshness with Paolo seemed an error. The problem is that the error was not in his human judgment. The error was a setup that never made sense to us. When we observe an error in human judgment, a good story will help us understand how the wrong decisions were made. Perhaps even convince us that we would have made the same errors if we were in the character's shoes. Then the correction of this error has weight. If we have no access to understanding the original decisions, it is less error than stupidity. And I don't use stupidity here as a dismissive term, but as an analytical one. So Tolstoy once told this story about a childhood group of friends he had. And there was one boy among them whose actions always baffled the others. And they worked so hard to understand him, to crack the mystery of this bizarre little boy, until one day Tolstoy just realized that this boy was very stupid. And Tolstoy told this story to explain how he, as a grown-up, would try very hard to make sense of some vexing aspect of life. And he could finally let go of all this confusion when he just remembered how prevalent stupidity is in the world. The lesson here is that stupidity is inert. It doesn't lend itself to our understanding. It doesn't deepen our sympathies. That's why the prince's tearful words in this moment, they land with limited force. His actions were mysteriously stupid. We can still mourn tragic events, but the arc of great tragic narrative that helps us understand those events and learn about ourselves in them is missing. So it's time for the prince's speech to the Senate. He's introduced as a future senator, so he's given someone the impression that he's accepted the offer. The prince says that these few days he's spent in turn have been very important. They've reminded him of who he is. Then he proceeds to speak the thoughts of the novel about Sicilians, their history, and their nature. It's a very truncated version, and at the end, he declines the offer to join the Senate. Chevalier asks him to reconsider, and the prince says no. However, he recommends Sadara for the position. One of the very jarring things in this scene is that because of how unintelligent the prince is in the miniseries, when you suddenly give him the prince's thoughts from the novel, it feels like a complete personality transplant. He can suddenly have coherent, soulful thoughts that are steeped in historical observation. But even though the words are there, this moment is not respected by the miniseries. It's interrupted by Concetta and Bombello making eyes at each other. And notice how in these shots, the people in the background don't even seem to be listening to the prince. More importantly, the film does not put any effort into the question of how do we see the prince in this moment he expresses all these deep thoughts. He is talking so fundamentally about who he is and the place he comes from. And this is the range of how the miniseries sees him as he talks. Plus this if you count the short snippet of conversation afterwards with Chevalier. Compare this with the film and its soulful shifting perspectives. Effort reveals your priorities. And this moment is of limited importance to the miniseries. After the speech, Bombello comes to speak with Concetta, who is just absolutely delighted to see him. He says, "I suppose you'll be leaving Turin, and I'll have to come to Sicily to speak with your father." And then he walks away. Bombello, she's in front of you now. You can talk to her now. You claim you'll walk to the ends of the earth to spend an hour in her company, and twice now you've cut your conversation off after a minute and just walked away. Now the prince and Concetta are in the carriage leaving Turin. The prince says, "Let's go home." Then he starts narrating the rest of Concetta's life. "We'll marry you to a nice Sicilian husband. You'll stay close by. You'll support your mother, help your brother." Concetta explodes. "I'm not your puppet. I need to live my own life without you. Bombello is going to ask for my hand in marriage, and I need you to say yes." Okay. Let's start with the prince. He's just had this realization. Man, I can't believe how wrong I've been in my decisions about everything. Let me now make another string of decisions, blind to everything going on around me. It's forced and frustrating. Regarding Concetta, I want you to know I have not skipped telling you about any Bombello and Concetta scenes. He spoke to her for a minute at her father's speech, and now she knows he intends to propose. This has even less of a foundation than her thinking Tancredi was going to propose. It feels wildly speculative on her part, and wildly presumptive on his part. The role of Concetta has been expanded from the novel to the miniseries, and there's the assumption by many that this is progressive. But scenes have also been added for the prince and for Tancredi, and that expansion in my mind is regressive. So it's not just a question of more, it's a question of quality. So let's reflect for a moment on the quality of the expanded scenes for Concetta. The few actions and statements made by the Concetta of the novel feel far more spirited and emotionally impactful than those of the miniseries Concetta. I feel like those moments really reveal something about the Concetta of the novel. It's disappointing that for all her additional screen time in the miniseries, every moment in her story is in relation to these men. First Tancredi, then away from her father, towards Bombello. For all her added screen time, I don't see her arriving at any sense of herself. And maybe she's right. Maybe she has to get away from it all for that process to begin. But we spent a long time with her in episode 5 for that process not to begin. We've spent a long time in episode 5.